Hey, welcome to the Struggle Cast. This week we are going to talk about social programs and an FDR New Deal plan up in Alaska. So stick with us for just a second and we'll get going on that. And hopefully you listen to the precast or some of these other podcasts that are available for download or for streaming. And could you do me a favor before we get going, if you are listening to this on one of our multiple outlets for the podcast, and it allows you to go ahead and like, subscribe, if it has comments, anything like that might help out in the algorithm, because policy and progressive programs don't exactly get into the algorithm that great, believe it or not. And if you're watching on YouTube, you can go ahead, like, subscribe, the notify button, the bell, comment away, do all that fun stuff, try to keep it relevant. I'm trying to build something here, and can't do that without your help. And again, looking out for our fellow working people. No desire to do a paywall or any of that kind of junk, but if you can donate to the show, there's a link in the podcast, or you can go to the webcast, the webpage, strugglecast.com. Or find multiple ways to help out the show on YouTube. There should be a donate button. So let's get there. And if there's not, webcast, like I said, go to the website, thestrugglecast.com, and we can try to keep this thing going. It can't exist without everybody else. So let's try to get together on this. So we talked a little bit in the last podcast about the rise of progressivism pretty much on the shores of the Mississippi, the Delta specific, but we were kind of really Arkansas side of the river specific, and I left you with a little bit about Johnny Cash, who grew up on the Matanuska Colony there, which was one of about 100 programs, farm programs set up in the New Deal, part of FDR's recovery from the Depression, and I believe it calls it the Revitalization of Industry Act or something like that. We'll get to that in a second. I'll get more specific. And again, it can be fodder in the comments or whatever you want it to be, but we're going to paint with some broad brushes. This is not a super deep dive way into the weeds, so before you comment about, well, this specific thing, my goal here is to try to get people interested enough to understand what is possible and what has already been possible, and how we might be able to find a corollary and apply it to today. So hopefully this inspires you. If you are that person that wants to really get into the debate, into the weeds, we can do that in the comment section, and hopefully it inspires you to click on some links yourself and, get to that. So now we're going to talk about what was fascinating. Coming off the 20s, when the Dust Bowl and the beginnings of the Depression, we got the New Deal and a series of public works. We got that in, was it 33 to 39 is when the majority of it went on. And spoiler, teaser, that includes the CCC, the Civilian Conservation Corps, which I hope to take a really deep dive into in the future. That's going to be a much longer, probably a part 1 and part 2. There's just so much there that is so relevant and set up other parts of history that people are fascinated with, particularly all the World War II buffs. There's a lot in that. And if you hear a slight calming snore in the background, that would be a very ancient terrier. You can barely kind of see. Where is he? Right there. That's his paw. Anyway, so forgive me, I don't have the heart to kick him out of here, and if I do, he'll just sit at the door and whine, and that's no good for anybody, right? So anyway, so as part of this, and there was a thing called the Farm Security Administration, and so all these different programs came together, and we were talking about Johnny Cash. In the Matanuska Colony, it was about 500 farmers from all over Arkansas, And there were tons of these programs around. In fact, I'm going to look at some of these. There's a great map that I'm going to pull up here in a second. Oh, here we go. That shows you, there it is, a good map. And you can see there, especially along the delta, there's so many stars that are overlapping. And then you see a lot of these in the upper Midwest. And the majority of these programs took place in the rural South. You see there's Mississippi, Arkansas, Louisiana, Kentucky, Alabama, Georgia, Florida, South Carolina, and North Carolina, and even one in Virginia. And then it's, a couple programs in Missouri, Nebraska, Iowa. Well, I don't know if it's in Iowa, but it's close. South Dakota. Anyway, so you get the idea that this was a very rural population, and the idea was if we could get enough people relocated and become subsistence farmers, it gives them a leg up, something to move on, and a way to rebuild after the absolute economic collapse and calamity of the Great Depression. And well, I mean, we can say it's fact. The mishandling of the economy, kind of the pervasive problems that we're having today, a ruling elite, not a lot of equity, and a lot of hard and loose gambling with working people's money. But I digress. We'll get into that here in a minute. But so out of these farm programs, not just in Arkansas, today we're going to talk about one that took place in Alaska. Very strange for the time. And it was kind of controversial at the time, to be honest. Just like today, people forget that there was pushback in the 30s against a lot of these programs, as well as being, these bunch of commie pinkos and all that junk. There was that then, but, it's amazing when there's great struggle, a lot of that, hyperbole and nonsense kind of, my team, your team stuff starts to go away, and, it's kind of like the double-edged sword right now that we're living is, it's not, I don't think anybody feels good about where it's going. So, but I don't really see anyone doing anything to make it better either. And the bad news is it could go horrible. The good news is if it ever goes horrible, the belief in humanity and that there are way more good people than bad, that, at least then there's the possibility of something more equitable in the new, the world, not to get into too off topic, from the New Deal, but, all of these realities and social constructs and contracts, all of these things only exist when we all collectively agree to them. If we could ever get our stuff together, maybe we can figure that one out, and it starts a little bit better of a progression for humanity. So, but here we go. So what this was a program coming off the Depression. The agricultural Midwest was destroyed from the Dust Bowl, and that, I think, put a lot of pressure into finding new ways of farm management, crop management. How are we going to produce, for national security, how are we going to produce our own food? How are we going to do all these things and keep people at work and satisfied, because, you can't afford to have those other issues as well. So, it just came, FDR ran promising relief in 32, and when he came in 33, he took it as a mandate, and they went on. So one of the things that what we're talking about today is, at the time, it was the territory of Alaska. It had not been established for statehood, and they decided to create what's called the Matanuska Colony as part of a resettlement program, where they took a bunch of farmers from Minnesota, the upper Midwest. And this would be a good time to address this before we get in. Maybe get the bad news out of the way first. So before people even start typing, we can avoid some of this. These policies, again in 1933, were based on very flawed and biased logic. The idea that white Scandinavians from Wisconsin would be better suited to the climate in Alaska, that kind of stuff, is based in some. We know that doesn't matter. People survive everywhere. So we're going to acknowledge that, and I'm not going to get into because that's really another long discussion that bleeds into a lot of other things. So for the sake of today's podcast, we're not going to try to judge the motivations of the people that were taken or why. And again, that we're not dismissing the fact that the people that were resettled were impoverished farmers that needed it. So it's not, this wasn't like some buddy nepotism, beltway crap that you get in D.C. But you did have people in D.C. making some decisions based on pretty outdated thinking. And then the second scab that we're going to go ahead and pick at involving this colony is we're going to have to acknowledge that it took a long time for the first world and the first people, First Nations, indigenous people, and natives of Alaska to, get their just due as well. I have no doubt that there was probably conflict created when these settlers were gone there. But that's a little bit more on the sociological. Today we're going to talk about the actual policy and how it worked. I don't think a lot of people know that what's possible. So we had a lot of pressures at this time. So we're talking again in 1933, coming off the heels of a global depression. I mean, which I would love to say is, in this day and age, a once in 1,000, but how many generations of us have lived through these economic failures now repeatedly over and over for pretty much the same reasons. But so what they decided to do, I think it was 15,000 families nationwide, but we're going to talk about just Palmer, Alaska. So anyway, they had recruited these families from the upper Midwest, and on the guise of, hey, if you go here, we're going to build you a house, a barn, give you the land to work. I believe it was 40 acres, and to try to scale up some sort of a large-scale agriculture in the area. I think they had known that, in theory, on paper, the location in the Matanuska Valley, which is very rich and fertile land, incredibly fertile land, made up of, you've got, man, it's crazy, these 100-pound cabbages and stuff that are now grown. We'll get to that and all that fun stuff here in a minute. But so anyway, we're in the New Deal. We decided we would send these travelers and resettlers to Alaska to try to get that going. So they get there, and it's pretty fascinating that you would resettle there. There was really literally no. We still think about the lack of resources and stuff that could possibly be there. Everybody watches the Alaska programs to get an idea of what rugged authenticity looks like, right? But in the 1930s, it really was a wild and woolly place. So, there were original inhabitants in the area, and if I'm not mistaken, they were relocated, which is, just trash. You know what I mean? That's the history. But I digress. Away from that, and we can talk about that at a different point. The marginalization of Native peoples is not unique to Alaska nor to this government program. And unfortunately, it probably won't be the last, as we continue moving this way. Um, but so the Matsu Valley is it's about 40 miles, I guess, north of Anchorage, sitting between. There's two rivers pretty much that are there, and it's surrounded on three sides by mountains, which kind of modulates the temperature a little bit because you're getting a lot of the Pacific moisture and warmth coming up and trapped by these mountains. Kind of keeps it there and plenty of water, and the soil had been, we're talking about glaciated soil that's been pretty much fertile and untouched for thousands of years. Add to that 20 hours plus sunlight in the summer, mild temperatures, and it just, boom, you would think on paper. And it turns out, not only in paper, but in soil, they do grow these monstrous vegetables. And now I think it's a big dairy area as well that, and they help provide the needs still to this day, that area agriculturally. So they moved all these families up there, and things, and there just wasn't a lot there. And if you're gonna have anything there, you've got to have food. You've got to have a way to feed a populace. And this really came back as a benefit not long after, in a great race during the World War II to get the Pan American Highway built. I actually had relatives that were Seabees stationed on the Aleutian Islands fighting during World War II. And, if it wasn't for some of this population and repopulation, it would have been just even more unbearable. I mean, the Pacific Theater World War II was horrific, and Attu Island in Alaska and the Aleutian Chain was the second bloodiest battle after Iwo Jima. It's just horrific. But anyway, so when they moved about 40 miles north of Anchorage is Palmer, and so this is where they settled these families. And when they put these families in, what they did, they, like I say, they gave them a barn, gave them means to provide for themselves. And that's exactly, it took off like a rocket, Now, the problem, going forward, and just like and it's no different than the other farm colonies that were created in that period, including the Dice Colony that we were talking about with Johnny Cash. I mean, slowly as things got better, it went away. A lot of the agriculture went away from the colony and the social aspect to becoming industry and business as more people came there. And, the other end of capitalism crept in. So it's kind of interesting now that I'm thinking about it that this New Deal relocation program was set up, in a very communal socialist colony way, and there were rules to follow and things that had to be done to stay in good graces with the federal government and to keep the money coming, etc. But it's unique to me to think that the successes of these, collective farms and colonies across America and even into, at the time, the territory of Alaska, were the foundations and the beginnings of a economy in a capital sense in those areas. Even though I guess that could be argued briefly, at least in the Delta, it didn't work out so well. It's still dealing with a lot of problems and poverty, which maybe that can be another podcast another day. But right now we're up in Alaska. So couldn't have been a better place to settle, and they did. If you haven't seen any of the pictures, you should. It's absolutely amazing. These fruits and vegetables are crazy. So anyway, this was a 80,000 acre project with the families. in 1948, only 31% of the original colonists remained. A lot of that was due to, there are a lot of challenges. I mean, and it's again back to the watching the Alaska programs too. You see the challenges that people are putting up with in a modern world. And not everybody's built for that. But a lot of the colonists, again, the ones that left, 69% of the people that went on to do other things didn't necessarily leave Alaska. They went on to other lives and lifestyles. Some homesteaded. A lot became in timber. And you got to remember there was a timber and mining boom there, and especially after the 50s, they were quite aware of the strategic nature of the place and oil, minerals, etc. Not just commercial fishing, but again, to have all of these industries, you've got to have food, and so it was interesting. So looking into the weeds a little bit, it was around $5 an acre is what these settlers they set up to a deal. It wasn't like they just got on a train and everybody sitting there and here's your stuff. They still had to basically it was like a 30-year mortgage on a farm, and the government backing it up, insuring it, and making sure they had everything. So almost like today's tech ventures and startups, they got basically the government acted as a venture capitalist for them. So they gave them the capital and got them moving. What's crazy is they didn't use money in the beginning. They were using like script, almost like company store stuff, because there just wasn't a need for it there, and you were so far away from everywhere. It just didn't, it just didn't do well. There was a train at the time. There wasn't a whole lot of options. The roads were horrible. It was very cold. And I don't know if a lot of people realize it can get quite warm there in the summer as well. I was there, and it was well into the 90s, a couple times when I was up there and closer to the interior of the state. Anyway, they did. The primary cash crop at the time was potatoes. They were growing, approximately 2,500 tons, 10 to 17 tons per acre, with the quality being excellent and being some of the best. And they had incredible yield on what they call thoroughly ripened grain: wheat, barley, oats, winter rye, hay, peas, vetch, silage of oats and peas were also successful. You could see that they started their own cooperative farmers market at the time too, and you get this amazing food. And by the 60s, what's crazy is, really by the mid 40s, the dairy herds in the area had exploded. I mean, you have this great grazing land that's not horribly inhospitable, especially in the summer months, for your livestock. There were like 33. Let me see where I have it on. I think there were 33 different dairies graded, A plus and A, by the 40s, and through the 60s, they kind of focused on the milk, dairy industry, and the potato business. And then, it kind of, so they kept going with that. And so, it roughly had a population of about 800, people. Again, a harsh climate. There had been homesteading already in the area along where they were building the railroads in the early 19-teens at the time, but nothing, a massive. You had pretty much a little community in town, literally a colony, not almost overnight, but pretty close to that. And, you know, there are still a lot of descendants from the original people there. And in the original areas there, they still have their state fair, which is, you know, from all accounts, I haven't actually gone to that. I've seen the pictures. It's pretty impressive. And again, I can't understate how bananas the crops, the vegetables, the fruits, and even the livestock grow. It's just insane. And all of that funded and found through a New Deal project that raised, like I say, a whole lot of families out of poverty. And now we'll slide a little away from the Matsu Valley, which I think is a fantastic place. And you just think about it. I mean, here's a New Deal colony in the New World, the last frontier, and it was sold as that for quite a bit. There was some great, fantastic. So there was a lot of propaganda at the time. Obviously on the New Deal, and we had to sell. You know, FDR and his administration really making the sell to help people. And, you know, it's kind of sad that we think about it. You know, I always said progression is, you know, inches, and regression is like, you know, a whole football field at a time. You know, hundreds of meters and hundreds of yards at a swath. But, you know, there was even a Broadway play. I believe there was one. It was called 200 Were Chosen, and I think it was actually on Broadway, and it kind of depicted the lives of these brave resettlers that were going to go off to the frozen north and tame, you know, kind of this nostalgic, going to tame the wild, you know, man versus nature, and, you know, this rugged individual Americanism that is interesting, that we take away the rugged individualism, that yet none of this would have been possible if it wasn't from like a collective effort and definitely a progressive policy. And it became quite a spectacle before these colonists. I mean, like every point of their relocation, from leaving their hometowns to traveling across country, generally to Washington, where they would then steam or train, ferries, boats to get to Alaska along with their equipment. I mean, this was like a followable story back in the day, and people did. And to a degree, it remains the fascination with Alaska, and people still back then still had such a fascination for Alaska as we do today. Again, see all the TV programming. This idea of these pioneers going out to, you know, settle the wilderness. This particular project ended up being the most famous of all the projects. So, like, you know, the reason I bring up Johnny Cash, and most people don't realize that he grew up on a New Deal, dare I use the word socialist, but a New Deal program farm colony collective in East Arkansas. And I don't think there's anyone that can't take away and understand, oh, okay, especially if you listen to his music or know anything about his life, like, oh, that clearly had some influence and bearing on him as a man and as an artist. So, but anyway, so they followed them disproportionately. They followed these people all the way to Alaska. And again, at the time you're talking about, like, these were impoverished Midwestern farmers, you know. They had stars in their eyes too, and, you know, it wasn't always the case. You know, you get off you know, when they first got there, I mean, everything was pretty much a tent city, and winter's coming. Not to get too Game of Thrones, but, you know, legit, the first groups arrived on May 9th in 35, and, you know, there's those old canvasy tents. I'll see if I can get one up here. And, you know, it was basically a tent city overnight. And, you know, that's a tough experience. And as somebody that's been up there, The mosquitoes probably, I mean, there's a lot to deal with other than just hot and cold, just like any place. Uh, so anyway, they got up there, and once they got there, they drew lots. There were 200 tracts of land total. They were divided into 40 acre parcels of 144, and then 52 tracts that were 80 acres, and 12 tracts that were reserved for future. Um, some of the land was cleared, some of it wasn't. Um, it was offered up anywhere from $1.25 to $4 an acre. The cleared land cost way more than the raw land, obviously. And I think that they played a 3% loan for 30 years, and didn't have to start paying the loans for like a 5 year. There's like a 5 or 6 year grace period, 5 years, and they set up portable sawmills. They got busy. Um, Most of them were what we would call, cottages, etc. Kind of a square, um, you know, as practical as you could, all lumber. And like I said, most of these were the original that most people built onto and made better over time. But the first necessity was getting out of the tents, so these weren't exactly, obviously, fancy homes, bare minimum. And, you're talking long days, a tough climate, and by nature of what it is, so much respect for farmers. People don't really understand how much hard ass work goes into getting food. Um, and there was this unique phenomenon up there that still, I think, happens, and was fortuitous at the time, because what helped a lot of these settlers get into structures and having the lumber available was this phenomenon that continues to this day of transient workers that were just showing up in Alaska, and they would work in sawmills and help build the actual construction and work with the settlers to build things. And I find it unique. Oh, bus just went by. That's still kind of the idea of the place. This, place where if you just want to get away and do things, that's where you go. Um, Oh, this is a funny quote I just saw. Back to the group of transients and stuff. This is how it was described by the Evening Star, which was a Washington, D.C. paper, evening paper, back in June of 1935. And I quote, "No outfit on the project embraces more odd characters than the construction crew. 2% of the crew are college educated. Somehow they went haywire and drifted into some California transient camp and enrolled in this Alaska adventure," end quote. So, for some of us, in fact, being a big Jack London guy, he split and went to Alaska early in his life. So it's just, there's always this through line, even through, and not to get too literal, but I mean, the Christopher McCandless, the, Alex Supertramp stuff, like, it seems like this was always the place. And I'm starting to question now if how much of that was the propagandizing of this program at the time that really instilled into our culture and our collective psyche that this is the place of true freedom and ingenuity, and the place that fits for people that don't really fit in any place. You know what I mean? And when we were up there, it's like the odds are good, but the goods are odd, that kind of a deal. So I think it's fascinating that you got that out of that program too, because not only is it benefiting, and I think that's the thing about the New Deal and a lot of other policies is when we focus on the right here in front of you tangibles and kind of forget that sometimes there's really strong benefits there on the periphery as well that just kind of get lost in the scramble there. So it continued to grow. The transient workers kept getting it going. So now they have homes, and by this point, we're gearing up for, wars in the air. There's, the drum beats are being heard everywhere. So this community, by being there, didn't even realize that they were setting the stage for the greater expansion, not only of, not say empirical America, but pre-World War II, we were manifesting the destiny of the Great White North, right? But, with World War II on the horizon, it turned out to be beneficial. And then it solidified the strategic value of the area, which led ultimately to the statehood and, a source of resources for good or for bad for the nation writ large. But they had schools. They created what's called a colony market, and it just continued to grow. Which kind of, after the farming took root there, and still to this day is an agricultural center for the state. I think it's super cool that now it's still the same. It's the location of the state fair that we were talking about earlier, where, again, do yourself a favor if you're on the podcast, go Google some of these vegetables. If you're on YouTube, I'll try to show them for you real quick. But they're just ridiculous, like this monstrosity, and they're fantastic, and obviously in the fallout after, making it more habitable, and obviously having, especially being able to raise hay and grains to feed the livestock. So now you've got livestock, you're now having proteins, you've got dairies, you've got plenty of grains and fresh vegetables. You can start becoming a sustainable area, especially one that's so remote. And again, at this time, it's almost unimaginably how remote it was for the average American. I know how long the flight is. Good God, I couldn't imagine overland. So, pretty fascinating things. Again, it continues to live on to this day as the agricultural area that's roots are in progressive socialism of the 1930s, and glad we have it. So that's pretty much a broad stroke on the Matanuska Valley Colony in Palmer, Alaska. Another New Deal project. And if you liked it, then listen to something else we've got up there. I think like I say, we've got a little taste of progressivism on the Delta. And there's one about the CIA and the IQ Zoo, and I'll try to get some more content like that here shortly. But for this week's Strugglecast, we were in Palmer, Alaska. I hope you learned a little bit about what's up there. Check out the precast. It's a little bit different. Probably not going to learn as much, and hopefully you learn something here. At the very least, you learn that it exists and it existed. And there's still people there, and quite a community that it's sustained. So that's this week's Strugglecast. I'm Barry. Again, click, download, subscribe, notify, bells, icons, comments, fight the algorithms, donate money, do whatever you can to help out. Make sure you're nice to other people. And just remember that try not to blame people for the actions of policy and politicians. Again, whatever your political beliefs or our own discourse on that, just try to hold it in that be as loyal and as cheerlead as much as they are loyal and cheerlead back. And if that's not happening, make it better. You have that power. So, stick with us. Stick around. Try to support the channel in any way you can. Let's fight the algorithm. Try to make this a regular. And I'll try to get some more content posted up to you. The next talk we're going to have is, I I haven't decided yet. Maybe you can put some input in. You got a week. Um, but I'm really fascinated. We're going to get past the New Deal stuff and probably get to some other topics. But once we move past that, we'll go on and we'll get there. But the CCC is really on mine, so we might get to that and talk about the CC next week. But we'll see. Maybe it'll be a surprise to both of us. So have a great week. Share, do all those things, and we'll see you on the next one. Y'all be good.